Good afternoon, everybody. We will now start our workshop today. So on the behalf of Transform Europe, me and my colleague Dagmar Svendova want to warmly welcome you to this European Forum 2021 workshop entitled 100 Shades of European Union, Mapping the Political Economy of Europe Peripheries. As you may know, the European Forum is a space of common discussion where the left, Greens and progressives come together and share their struggles. We'd like to highlight that this year's edition has started already on the 15th of November online and will last until the 27th. We will share more information on the European Forum in the chat throughout this session. Let's say a few words on Transform Europe for those who don't know us already. So Transform Europe is a network of 39 European organizations from 23 countries active in the field of political education and critical scientific analysis. It is also the recognized political foundation of the European Left Party. My name is Tatiana Moutinho. I work for Transform. I am based in Porto, Portugal, and I am responsible for the cooperation strategies for Southern Europe strategic line in Transform. My colleague Dagmar Svendova facilitates Transform's strategic line on the Central and Eastern Europe, and she's based in Bratislava in the Czech Republic. Both of us will moderate today's session together with Liliana Pinto from the European Forum's organization. Before we start, let me just share with you some technical information. We have French simultaneous interpretation available. If you want to follow the session in French, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, click on the planet icon and choose the French language. Also, this workshop is being recorded and will be made available later in Transform Europe YouTube channel. Finally, throughout the session, if you'd like to pose any questions to the speakers, there is a Q&A box for that purpose. Questions and comments will be collected and addressed to the speakers later. So let us now proceed with this workshop. You may ask why we decided to address the issue of peripherality in the European Union. As we know, European Union is a very diverse political and cultural space, despite its leaning towards unity and uniformity. And it is not possible to understand the EU without understanding the power asymmetries that are implicit to its functioning. Therefore, to have a comprehensive understanding of the European Union as an economic and political space, we also need to focus on the question of peripherality through the lenses of peripheral regions, the so-called Old Periphery, the Southern European countries, and the New Periphery, or Central and Eastern European countries. So our research project, 100 Shades of European Union, Mapping the Political Economy of Europe Peripheries, was launched in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation more than a year and a half ago. We plan to release the full study in the first quarter of 2022. By doing so, we seek to accomplish three major goals. The first one is to make use of the political economic mapping of Southern, Central and Eastern regions as a tool not only to build bridges and cooperation strategies between these Euro peripheries, but also for policy making within and beyond these regions. Secondly, we want to understand the current forms and manifestations of power asymmetries and dependencies as means to discuss and to bring to the center stage of political discussion on the European integration process and the future of the European Union. Finally, we strive to provide a contribution to the process of peripheries self-representations by contemplating visions of the East by the East and the South by the South that may dispute and counteract the hegemonic narrative of the core as the only dependency and power mechanism in play. I would now like to give the floor to my colleague Dagmar. Dagmar, please.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for this introduction. Perhaps you may ask how we want to accomplish these goals. We want to address in this study the three major axes of analysis. Firstly, we evaluate the socio-economic characterizations and developments of each periphery over the past recent decades, as well as in-depth analysis of the trade networks and comparison between the regions, aiming at understanding their differences and commonalities. This part of the study deals with each region separately, based on an extensive data collections and analysis of the available economic and social indicators that characterize the structure of these economies, with aim to bring all the data together in a comparative way. Secondly, we deal with the political causes, dimensions, and consequences of the core periphery divide. In this part, we analyze the interplay of both Euro-peripheries with the EU while focusing on the core periphery divide. This analysis should therefore help us to understand what the possibilities of peripheries are to influence the EU decision-making process and the EU strategies. We also explore existing coalitions, cleavages, and questions of representations in the EU. Finally, we also pay attention to the cultural and discursive representations of the peripherality in the EU. We focus on coarse hegemonic narratives about these peripheries by approaching them beyond the socio-economic reality as social constructions. This research has been conducted by an interdisciplinary team of researchers coming from economics, sociology, political sciences, and history, anthropology fields. The team is here with us today and will present and discuss our preliminary findings with us.
So it is our pleasure to introduce now them to you. So first we have Veronika Szuszova-Salminen, a Czech comparative historian based in Finland. Veronika has a PhD in anthropology at Charles University in Prague. Her field of specialization is history and politics of modern Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and post-Soviet space. Veronika works as a researcher at the Center of Global Studies in Czechia, and she is editor-in-chief of the web magazine Argument. We also have with us Valentina Petrovic. Valentina is Serbian. She's a PhD candidate in the Institute of Political Science at the European University, and she's currently doing a postdoc at the Department of Sociology at the University of Zurich.
At least I would like to introduce Giuseppe Celi, an Italian economist, currently associated professor of economics in the University of Foggia. He was also a coordinator of the PhD program in economic theory at the University of Foggia, and Italian coordinator of the MA program Erasmus Mundus, Economics of International Trade and European Integration. He has recently published, together with the other authors, the book entitled Crisis in the European Monetary Union, a Core Periphery Perspective. We would also like to mention the 3 junior researchers who were responsible for the collection and treatment of the socio-economic indicators and other research data collection and preparation for each of 3 regions, namely Dorota Kolarska from Poland, Yanis Klias from Greece, and Kalin Kaciulanu from Romania. So the time has come for us to turn to our researchers with the first question. Valentina, perhaps it would be useful to elaborate on the terms core and periphery. How do you understand these terms, and how can we study core-periphery relations within the EU? Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dagmar. First, we wanted to thank all of you on behalf of all three senior researchers for organizing this event and for giving us this opportunity to speak about the project to a broader audience. So regarding your question, there have been several recent studies that have documented political and economic polarization patterns in the European Union. And here it needs to be highlighted that the promise of economic convergence and economic growth between richer and poorer countries was a feature of European integration right from the onset. This promise remained unfulfilled apart from the short convergence period until the economic crisis in 2008. And especially if we have a long-term perspective on development and growth in the European Union. So given the persistent discrepancies and inequalities between the regions, we start from the premise that competition and therefore growth is driven by the economic structure of a country. And in this context, historical legacies play a decisive role for a country's starting position once European Union integration hits in. And how do we understand the core periphery terms in our study, and how do we use these concepts? So depending on which indicator one uses, different classifications of core periphery arise. We have chosen several socio-economic indicators that help us to understand different development levels in the three regions. And the selection of the indicators in our study was driven by existing research and literature on core periphery relations. So in our case, we focused inter alia on at GDP per capita, GDP growth rates, public and private debt rates, indicators on informality, social exclusion, and inequality, but also indicators on trade union and collective bargaining institutions. And in line with current research on core peripheral relations within the European Union, we see the concepts as being characterized as relational, spatial, and non-static. Relational because without the core, there is no periphery. Spatial because geographical distance is the manifestation of an historical process leading to a widening gap between core and periphery, in which the growth of political communities was driven by the core areas, which were politically, administratively, economically, and educationally advanced than the periphery. And the concepts of core and periphery are also non-static, as economic as well as political characteristics can change over time. And therefore, a state's core periphery position within the broader regional and global system can also change. So the two peripheral regions within the European Union are the South and the East, whereby we divided the East according to Central Eastern European countries and Southeastern European countries. So the former would mean or would analyze the country, the V4 countries, so the Visegrad 4 countries, plus Baltic states, whereas the Southeast European countries consist of Croatia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And this we developed because we strongly believe that without taking the structural imbalances and country-specific characteristics into account, we cannot give adequate policy recommendations at the EU level. Thank you.
Valentina, thank you very much for this classification and clarification of the terminology and specification of the mapped regions. I turn to Giuseppe now. Giuseppe, why it is, in your view, so important to revitalize the discussion on the core and periphery relations within the EU?
Thanks, Dagmar, for this question. Good afternoon, for all of you. So I think that the revival of the terms core and periphery in the debate of European integration should not be a surprise. No? Why? Because the expectation of convergence among European countries has been completely disappointed. No? And two crises in recent years, 2008 crisis and coronavirus crisis, with austerity in the middle of these two crises, don't forget this, have revealed dramatically limits and imperfections of the current structure of institutional, economic, and monetary relations in Europe. And however, we have to consider that the European Monetary Union crisis, the Euro crisis itself, has distant roots. A few years ago, Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize for the Economics, in a very synthetic but very enlightening way, framed the crisis of the European project as a sort of punishment, a punishment deriving from a set of mistakes of various nature. For example, of policy nature, the bad sequence envisaging monetary union first and political union later, or mistakes in terms of economic theory, the neglect of Keynesian lesson in favor of a monetarist and supply side approach to the economy, or mistakes in terms of decision-making approach, authoritarian, in some way, self-reference in the imposition of rules, and finally, intellectual mystification, austerity proposed as a reform. So the accumulation of these mistakes over time has led Europe to the current paradox. On the one hand, an original project aimed at promoting convergence and harmonization among member countries. On the other hand, a reality characterized by big divides between strong areas and weak areas, between areas that manage value chain, creating opportunity for the development of new peripheries, as in the case of Germany with Eastern European countries, especially Visegrad Group countries, and deindustrialized areas which lose skilled workforce through migration flow and depending on external financial flows, as in the case of Southern Europe. But how did we get to a so polarized situation? I think that to answer this question, we should not limit the analysis to the years following the Euro inception, but it is necessary to have a longer-term view. And the same core periphery divergence in Europe, today so evident and dramatic, should be seen in a longer-term perspective. For example, the structural crisis of the 70s and the following liberalization policies of the 80s represented actually a turning point in the modalities of international competition, because this crisis, the crisis of the 70s, raised the standard required to stay on global markets, and product differentiation based on quality and innovation was a reaction to the saturation of the demand for mass consumer durables. And in this transition from a price-led competition to a product-led competition, some countries, like Southern European countries, fell behind, interrupting or slowing down the process of deindustrialization, while other countries like Germany faced the changing regime, the changing competition regime, by innovating the industrial structure. So this premature deindustrialization made peripheral countries more fragile with respect to external change even before the Euro inception. So with these trajectories of industrial development of the country so different since the 1970s, a project of monetary unification with a strong neoliberal connotation as European Monetary Union, and with the convergence criteria referring to financial rather than real indicator, entailed problems of sustainability over time. No? Inevitably, no? Problems of sustainability over time. In other words, the European Monetary Union was from the beginning an institutional construction with problems of embeddedness, no? Eradicated from the specific socio-economic institutional context of the member countries and indifferent to the divergent in their levels of development, which is at the origin of a different ability to respond to change and external shocks. So I think that it's important to adopt a long-term perspective also to understand the current core periphery dynamics in Europe. Yes. I hope to...
Giuseppe, thank you very much. Thank you very much. After all what was said so far, it seems that understanding the historical context is absolute necessity. And I think that's one of the points you just made. Therefore, I will turn to Veronica, as you are a comparative historian. Let me ask you, what was the historical context of the European integrations from the South and the East in the EU?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. And now we will turn a bit attention to one of the important tasks we are doing, and that is the comparison of both regions, because we want to understand their differences and commonalities, be able to somehow define their key problems, find where are the conflicts and where are also possibilities for cooperation. I would like to underline that comparison is always synthetic. It's always needs some kind of level of generalization. However, of course, you must be also able to feel nuances, to be able to notice differences and understand them from the context. What we found out until now is, and it's probably absolutely not anything super new, is that it is very important for your position in the European Union to understand how you was integrated into the European project, how your integration was going on, through which instrument, with what kind of accents, in what kind of global and European circumstances. Now I will compare these two regions. I will just simply use the term the South and the East. However, we have to realize that, as we already said, these are diverse regions. We had to divide them, we had to differentiate them slightly, but I will speak on the general level more or less, with the fact that in the South the situation is slightly different, because there is standing as a country Italy. We have to realize that Italy is a founding country of the European project. So if we compare her, we have to realize this specific position of Italy as a founding country of European project, and as a country which, however, became to be on the path of divergence in the current time. You can see that Italy is recently basically peripherized increasingly. It's not in the core. While you have, of course, small countries like Malta and Cyprus, which, by the way, were integrated within the integration which took place in the beginning of 21st century. And then you have three countries, Greece, Spain and Portugal, which, in my opinion, actually became, when they were integrated, the Southern Europe as a periphery became to be existing in the European economic community, of course. So I would like to now focus mostly on them now I don't want to use some kind of negative term, but let's say like as instruments for the Southernization of European Union. Now I don't mean it in any negative way. I just mean that they are entering in the process in which Italy is already in. And if you look at it, you can see that they entered in after the quite important political discontinuities, changes in the political system of these three countries, which is very important to realize. However, the regimes which were existing before, they were of course still part of varieties of capitalism. There were not any alternative for the capitalism. However, they were entering the European integration project from as an exit strategy, as a strategy for modernization, as a strategy to move themselves from basically the peripheral position they have been for maybe already 200 to 300 years, to modernize themselves politically, economically, and in other ways. So there were huge expectations connecting with it. There was the spirit which was related with the democratization of these regimes. And in this, you can find the commonality with the East, of course, if you think about it. But there is the difference, and this difference is important nuance. East started to be integrated in the 1990s after the collapse of systemic collapse, so not as a result of political discontinuity, but as a result of the systemic failure of the state socialism. And from this point of view, this was a much more, we can say, dramatical change, because it really influenced not only political sphere, not only economic, but also social life and even the social formation, social structure of these societies very dramatically. So in this sense, you are in different position if you compare the Southern European countries, which I was pointing out, and if you compare the East. Also here, however, if you look at the expectation, the idea is very same. There was the return to Europe, so-called, the idea that Europeanization will solve our problems, which was also quite apparent in the South before, that it will help us to get rid of the legacies of socialism and also of authoritarian regime before. So in this sense, there were very similar expectations, even they were coming from different contexts. As you can see, this was the systemic failure, is different context than just the regime change, but it's of course both in a way very important kind of hope. If we talk about, if we can name it like this. So both regions are entering the European Union in particular time with particular expectations. These expectations are very same, and unfortunately we are learning slowly, both regions, that they are not fulfilling and there is something happening. We will later speak about it when we look at the economic models. I want only now very shortly mention other thing which is important, and that is, in my opinion, if you look at the broader picture, if you look at the global circumstances in which these both regions are integrating, then we can have really understand that both of them are integrating at the moment when something is happening in the global economy, something important. And I call it, I propose to call it beginning and end of neoliberal circle, because the Southern European countries, basically this bulk of them in 1980s, is actually entering the European project at the time of crisis of Keynesianism, as you know, at the part of which we can call as interregnum, while the East is entering in the time when you have triumph of neoliberalism, when the interregnum is ending, and actually the Eastern European countries entering the European Union, and the transformation should be seen as a flagship of the new neoliberal consensus. This is how it should work, this is how it should be done, this is how economy should be restructuralized, and the European Union is unfortunately playing already a very important role in it, because in the early 90s, European Union is also neoliberalizing itself. So this is very important to see these global circumstances, beginning and end of neoliberal circle. And of course, in the part of Eastern Europe or East, we have to add to it the failure of the state socialist project, which I would agree with Ivan Berend, who is Hungarian economic historian, was an attempt to break the chain of peripheral position. And in this sense, it failed. And the whole transformation and Europeanization was actually returned back to the peripheral position after this, I don't want again to use some kind of derogative way, but after this experiment, after this effort, or basically after this 40 years of efforts to create the new alternative system in the world economy. So I think this is enough for the beginning. It's enough complex, and we can return maybe when I will speak about the economic models more.
Veronica, thank you very much for this. Surely we will return to speak about the economic models a little bit later in our discussion. But now I will return back to Giuseppe and ask him what new peripheries have emerged in Europe and which fragilities can be recognized.
Simplifying the picture, in economic terms, we have one core and two peripheries, southern and eastern peripheries, both linked for better or for worse to the emergence of a Central European manufacturing core. Because since the euro inception and the eastward enlargement of the EU, a profound reorganization of the European industrial structure led to the emergence of the Central European manufacturing core, as according to the definition of two Austrian economists, Sterer and Stollinger. And this process has resulted in a consolidation of Germany as hegemonic economic power in the European Union and in a reshuffling of hierarchical relation between central and peripheral countries. On the one hand, the countries of Southern Europe have experienced a weakening of their industrial base and a growing dependence on financial flow from abroad. On the contrary, Eastern European countries becoming an integral part of the powerful European manufacturing platform managed by Germany have significantly expanded and strengthened their industrial base, displacing in part the production of Southern Europe. And our analysis of European trade network clearly demonstrate that a significant reorientation of trade flows has accompanied this reshuffling of hierarchical relationship between core and periphery. Already in 2007-2008, trade between the volume of trade between Germany and Visegrad countries exceeded that between Germany and the southern periphery. And of course, when we further refine the analysis by looking at trade in value added in order to investigate the participation to value chain, it becomes clear that this straightening of trade links between the core and eastern periphery is mainly due to the exchange of intermediate goods, which is prevalent in certain sectors, such as automotive sector. And this showed that the dependence of eastern peripheral countries on the value chain yes, it is a sign also of a fragility, as I explained now. Because this means that both peripheries are fragile, although differently fragile, because they are in an equal, in other words, in an equal condition of economic and financial dependence on the core. As I said before, the southern periphery has experienced a restriction of its manufacturing production capacity and a development model driven by low-tech sectors populated by small firms. How to say, there are in a condition of a middle-income trap. These firms are unable to sustain product-led competition in the European Union, and so in a most sophisticated market like that of the European Union, and cost-price-led competition in globalized international markets. So the structural weakening of the southern periphery has resulted in a stagnated economic dynamic, and also the increase in the number of low-wage employment has contributed to the stagnation of domestic demand in this country. And in recent years, of course, before the recent suspension of the fiscal compact, fiscal rules have imposed constraints on public spending and led to a deflationary environment that discouraged investment in Southern Europe. So in this situation, low growth reduces revenues and increases government borrowing, and so financing needs, and triggering a vicious circle that further worsens the relative position of Southern periphery. In the meantime, competition from firms in the other periphery, the Eastern periphery, especially Visegrad country group, has been increasing over time, and these firms are playing a predominant role as suppliers of intermediate goods for Germany industry. We know that low labor costs, a well-qualified workforce, generous subsidies and tax breaks, geographical proximity, historical ties, are all explanatory factors, determinants of the enormous influx of foreign direct investment in these countries, in East European countries, and especially from Germany. However, and this is the reason for the fragility also of the Eastern periphery, the development driven by the production decisions of the German multinationals has also made the Eastern periphery fragile and highly dependent on the coal. And because the industrial trajectory of the East is a mono-specialization trajectory, with the automotive sector playing the dominant role. Around this sector, there is not an equal development of other productive sectors. So the domestic market remain limited. The high growth rates recorded by this country are due especially to the growth of export of local production of foreign multinationals. In addition, policies to curb wage growth induce young people, also with high educational qualifications, to emigrate, weakening the skill base of this country. So, in conclusion, both peripheries are fragile, although for different reasons. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Giuseppe, for your explanation. I would like to pose a question now to Valentina. So Veronica has already addressed the historical context of these three regions that you have been studying. I would like to ask you, based on the research you have been developing so far, which would you say are the commonalities and differences between the three regions today?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for this question. Well, the first similarity between the three regional country groups is the experience of the industrialization process, which occurred naturally under different contexts and with different consequences for the countries. So in the southern economies, as we have heard, the premature deindustrialization process happened during the 1970s and 1980s, whereby this process occurred during the 1990s for the Eastern periphery. And Slovenia is hereby a partial exception. It experienced some deindustrialization process in its textile industry, but due to global trends and not primarily due to the EU integration process. It succeeded otherwise to uphold its industry during the 1990s without foreign direct investments, and this must be mentioned. This process of a premature deindustrialization process coincided with a reindustrialization process via impairing foreign direct investments in the V4 group. However, as research has shown, the positive effects of the FDI-led industrialization process needs to be interpreted with caution, as transnational companies did not have a substantial spillover effect on the economy. And moreover, the regional concentration of foreign capital has contributed to increased disintegration tendencies within the countries. So ultimately increasing core and periphery relationships within the country. So we do not have only core periphery relations between, inter-core periphery relations, but we also have intra-core periphery relations within the European Union. And furthermore, the Southeast European country group has experienced economic crisis during the 1990s as the Central East European country groups, with a high number of state-owned enterprises being destroyed. And within the Southeast European countries, apart from Romania, neither Bulgaria nor Croatia have actually experienced a reindustrialization process after the end of its socialist regime. So they are today in a very similar situation as the southern periphery in Europe. So in contrast to the V4, financialization targeted different sectors. So for example, the service sector or the tourism sector in Croatia and Bulgaria, but also in the southern country group. Secondly, we also observe in all three country groups rising private debt, especially before the economic crisis, but also afterwards, due to slow growing or stagnating real wages in the European periphery. And as living expenses cannot be covered with workers' salaries, rising private debt aims to cover these discrepancies. There are exceptions within the country groups, such as the Czech Republic and Slovenia, which have experienced higher wage growth and less rising inequality than the other countries that we study. And obviously today, the difference between the three regional groups is their integration within the German manufacturing chain and their position within the global division of labor. Whereas the V4 plus Slovenia exhibit strong links with the German manufacturing chain, the southern European countries and together with Croatia and Bulgaria, they are highly dependent on tourism, remittances, or foreign investments in their tertiary sectors, as I explained before. And naturally, those dependencies put these economies in a very weak position once they need to cope with an economic crisis or with a shock such as the corona or crisis. And lastly, also, one crucial difference between the southern and Central Eastern and Southeastern European states is their different integration within the EMU. Notably, those national economies who adopted the euro, they operate within a different policy context, and they are also highly constrained in their policy options versus those countries who did not or that did not adopt the euro.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. Maybe I would now turn to Veronica and something that she mentioned and stayed in the debate, which has to do with the economic models that we have in these peripheries. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this, Veronica?
Yes, thank you. I will link it to what Giuseppe said and also Valentina said, because they already give you a hint about this problem. In the research, we really focus on the characterization of different economic models in these two peripheries. We want to understand how what kind of economic and socio-economic dynamics is behind them. And we are trying to, as was already shown, compare them in order to understand these differences and the commonalities. we of course cannot say that one comparison model is totally 100%. You have to always go through the ideal tips in order to do it. But however, we can see that there are different economic models, and they are also different within the regions. So you can, for example, say what Giuseppe said about South European countries, besides about FDIs, besides Malta and Cyprus, which base their economic development on the tax evasions, and they are showing a very high level of incoming FDI to the economies in terms of GDP, which are differentiating them from the rest of the Southern Europe totally. And then you have, of course, differences within the Eastern region also. In general, you can say that the economic model in the East is really based on the FDI, that the FDI were seen as a way to go forward, as a motor or engine of growth for this for them. So FDIs were seen as basically a synonym of development and economic growth. So in this is also a huge difference between the model in South and in the model in East, that the FDI coming from the of course from outside are very hugely important, and there is different different targets of this outside capital, which is in different regions coming. And that already was said that, for example, East-South countries are having commonalities with the Southern Europe in terms of incoming these financialization, terrestrialization, and so on. But for example, in the region for which I am responsible, which is V4 on the one hand, and Baltic countries on the other hand, you can say the same about Baltic countries, because Baltic countries underwent consciously huge level of deindustrialization, because they saw the industrialization as a way as derussify. It means because the huge amount of population, of Russian-speaking population, was, by the way, workers in the industry. So the industrialization was partly really conscious selection of policy, and they really were underlining investments in sectors such as services, and such as financial services, real estate, generally it's called FIRE. This makes them, by the way, very vulnerable, and it was shown very quickly during the global financial crisis, because the crisis in the region was one of the worst hit was really for the Baltic countries. They lost nearly same level of, or slightly less level of gross domestic product very quickly compared with, for example, V4 countries. And they really underlined very much this as a solution for this problem, being dependent on the external financial sources and capital. By entering in the European Monetary Union, which actually didn't solve anything for them. So there are differences in this sense. Then, of course, very often we hear about V4 countries that they have productive base. And indeed, they have. They were able to partly revitalize it, partly they lost it. You cannot say that they have same amounts of industrialization as in beginning of 1990s. If you look at the levels of value added, the gross domestic product portion, or employment, neither of this is true. However, the industrialization was slow or stagnant, and they were able to keep important part of this sector alive. But there is a price for it. So fact is that if like East, if the Southern Europe is characterized by really incomplete industrialization and quick deindustrialization since the end of 80s and during the 90s, and then of course continues, then we cannot say that we won too much in this, because this is totally dependent productive base, which is much dependent on the particularly German capital, and which is causing particular deformation for the local economies, same like in the Southern Europe, but because of different reasons. It is dualism, creation of dualism within the countries. It is socio-economic impacts for the wages, for the well-being of the people, because if you are selling your work, cheap work, as a main plus for keeping your industrial base. You cannot simply have a developed domestic market. You cannot have ever consumption level as in the core. You cannot ever have quality of life as the core, and you basically are in the dependent position. Some specialists call actually this model as a dependent market economy. So it is really dependent on the decision making in somewhere else outside. This is clearly, it was already mentioned that it is connected very much with the automobile industry and with German capital. I don't say with Germany itself, I say German capital consciously. And this is not the recipe for the success. However, there are of course some pluses of this if you compare it with Southern Europe. Plus is that if you have still allocated so big amount of workforce in the industrial base, meaning working in manufacturing, you don't need to react so quickly on the outside changes, like if you have it in tertiary sector. The changes are slower. You have more maneuver space in this sense. You have more, in this sense, security. You could see it if you compare with the global financial crisis in South and in the East, in the Wave specifically, that the return to the growth was quite quick. Even there were a lot of damages in the economy after the crisis. Still, you can see that it was quicker if you compare it with South, and now, of course, also with East-South, because there also it was hitting much. So the thing is, say, at least we have some production base. Yes, we have in therefore, but there is the high price for it, and as Giuseppe already said, there are vulnerabilities coming out of it, and there is really it is all system which is connected to it. It includes the fact that, for example, you don't have any domestic capital. You have to really rely on money coming out. You don't have own technological base, because everything is coming from transnationals who are controlling their technology. So basically you are never can make the biggest money and have highest salaries because it's controlled somewhere else. And there is, of course, what already Valentina said, dualization in both cases, creating of core periphery within the regions, because it is known that FDIs, for example, are coming according to transnational corporations, and they never come where you need them. They come when they want to give them. So this is creating regional inequalities. And last thing which I want to say, when we speak about specifically this industrial core in the welfare countries, why this happened. This was not any miracle of capitalism, actually. This was path dependence created by the state socialist regime, because that was based on the industrialization. In the case of Czech Republic, for example, Czech Republic is one of the most industrialized part of, I would say, Europe, even, because actually the industrialization started very early, or in the beginning of 19th century. So this was kind of core characteristic was always there. We can see then what I already said about how we are integrated. You can see that the way how you are integrated is also based on the past dependence, on the decisions which were made before, and they are still influencing you. So in this sense, you don't, it was not the creation of something new, it was commodification of something which was created before, and recreating it in this productive basis. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Veronique. So we are now approaching almost 1 hour of our workshop. I want to remind the audience that if they wish, they can pose questions in the Q&A box or in the chat window, but there is a Q&A box for the purpose. And before to end this first round of questions, and I would like to ask Valentina something that has been already touched here and then by all of you, I would say, that has to do with this question of peripheral regions relative to a core. This implies the existence of dependency paths. Mm-hmm. Throughout, with your research, do you see specific dependencies for each of the 3 regions? And in case you do, how would you describe them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, we already touched upon this question, and I will try to summarize the basic dependency problems that those three regions have. So first, as we said already in the beginning, and also as Professor Celi mentioned, they are both dependent on the same core. And both peripheries are fragile due to their own domestic structural characteristics. The difference is that the southern economies became dependent on very volatile sectors, so tourism, remittances, foreign direct investments that target mostly services. And in cases of external shocks, such pillars are not likely to protect the economies and its citizens sufficiently. And this became also evident when looking how the Central East European economies, especially the V4, recovered after 2008, whereby the Southern country group has had great difficulties and continues to exhibit very sluggish economic growth until today. And it is highly unlikely that the Southern peripheral countries will change their position anytime soon. So, while the manufacturing sector in the Central Eastern European economies also depends on foreign direct investments, of course, they also exhibit more policy space due to not being part of the Eurozone, I mean, with exceptions. The most obvious example is Hungary's macroeconomic and fiscal policy after 2010. Which basically did not respect the criteria and the targets as set by the Copenhagen documents. And I mean, here we can mention once more Slovenia, because it is a telling example, because with regards to its productive structure and manufacturing sector, it would be a case with a good position to overcome crisis and maybe also to advance technologically. However, since Slovenia is part of the EMU and it adopted the euro in 2004, it was heavily hit by the economic crisis and by the austerity policies afterwards. And the crisis has weakened Slovenia's economy badly because it was so constrained in its policy options. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I would now ask for help for Liliana, whether there are any questions that have popped in in between.
Yes, thank you, Tatiana. We have a comment and question from Bojan Staliznavski, and it's for Veronica, and he's saying he likes very much what Veronica was saying in the previous intervention. It is pretty clear that you have dependent economies if your research and technological capacities are almost non-existent. But what is the way to get out of this?
This is maybe a question for everybody of us, and it's one of the questions we will try to answer in our research to find some kind of alternative solution. At the moment, we are definitely in the situation when this is very difficult to change, because we have governments which in general don't want to change anything. And if you look at the landscape, I would say all the system which we have of this dependency is also based on the domestic alliances which are within the region, and the alliances between the local, let's say, I call them honestly as compradors, and the outside capital, now not only necessarily from the European Union, but very often from the core countries of European Union. We spoke a lot about Germany, but it's needed to say that for the B4 countries, this is also Netherlands, for example. For Baltic countries, you have to take into account Sweden and Finland as next countries, which are for them kind of core investors, which are influencing very much their economic choices. So the way out of it, we were discussing it actually with Giuseppe some weeks ago. My question was, and he can maybe, because he's the economist here, I feel as a huge problem that we don't have any, if we stay within the rules of how works capitalist system. So we don't have any really strong domestic capital. This is the same for both countries. If you don't have domestic capital, which is willing to invest in your own investment, which is willing to support your other, basically the instruments for your own development, then hardly you can get out. In Web4 countries and Baltic, it's even worse. And of course, also for Romania, Bulgaria, these countries are not at the better situation. It's even worse that if we speak about capital, we have to say that they have highest level of foreign ownership of banks in the world. They're absolutely on the top of the world in this. It's over 80%. So you don't have even the basic things. If you want to take credit or whatever, you have to go to foreign-owned banks, which were privatized during, by the way, Europeanization process, during the accession to European Union. It was one of the conditions which was set. So maybe Giuseppe could elaborate on this question, how to solve the problem that the region, both regions are lacking strong domestic capital, which is enforcing the dependency.
Thank you, Veronica. Okay, so I think it's a good idea if Giuseppe could also help us with this, since he's the economist here, and also I'll take advantage to ask whether this, so following the pandemic, this Next Generation EU program that was launched by the European Commission this year, could this be a useful tool to address these imbalances between these regions and the core? Giuseppe, you must turn on your mic.
Yes, no, in the case of recently, I read a work about the position of Eastern European countries in the global value chain, and there is an upgrading in effect, also in the level of technology of Eastern Europe firms, But the problem is that there is not a corresponding upgrading, in the employment. This is not so. This is very strange, probably a possible, I don't know, a possible direction, is to hire high-skilled people and not induce them to emigrate, because there is an upgrading in industry, but there is not a corresponding upgrading in employment. Not this, so there is a space to go towards also an independent, if you want, development. Yes, Tatiana, Next Generation EU. I don't know if yes, on paper, this plan can give us a bit of hope, if you want, because this is the first time that European countries embark on a path of partial debt mutualization. And obviously, we will see how the plan will perform in practice, and if this plan will prove the precursor of common European fiscal policy, or when the pandemic will pass, will end, it will envisage, prove, yes, it will envisage, sorry, yes, envisage or not, the perpetuation, the introduction of fiscal rules, the old fiscal rules, and the conditionalities. The main instrument is the implementation of, at national level, of recovery plan, recovery and resilience facility plan. And on the paper, this plan would have the potential to arrive to an expansion of the internal market, especially if the three axes so emphatically suggested by European Commission, the three axes, digitalization, green transition, and social inclusion, were able to trigger a recovery in private investment. I think that in any case, we don't know if this plan will perform in a direction of expansion of internal market. But in any case, I think that 4 goals should be pursued for a real reduction of the divergence between core and periphery in Europe, the expansion of the German and European internal market, so balancing production capacity within the EU, a partial industrial reconversion towards sectors that meet social needs, such as education, health, and care, when until now, the important segment of the so-called European social model has been defined by negation, as non-tradable sector. So non-tradable sector, because they don't deserve to be promoted. Tradable sector deserve to be promoted. So we have to change this view. But during all the period of Europeanization, the obsession for competitiveness and for the export-led model, has been a leitmotiv. So we have to change the direction, in the sense of to expand internal market in terms of to fit social needs, to satisfy social needs, and obviously also shortening of value chain, because coronavirus has demonstrated how fragile are value chains. Obviously, the shift from, as in the case of Germany, an industrial platform designed for export to one designed for domestic market is a huge challenge. As to shift from a peace economy, from a war economy to a peace economy, if you want. Also, it's very big challenge. But I think that this transformation would be beneficial also for Germany, because now there are narrower margin of maneuver in terms of trade with USA and China. So also because coronavirus has demonstrated the fragility of value chain. So I think that, I don't know, probably this an opportunity. I don't know if it will be so, to change the perspective, to overcome this obsession for international competitiveness and the export-led model.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I think it brought some light. Hopefully also showing some light in the end of the tunnel, which is a challenge. But as we said, we are also still work in process. We hopefully will also come with some of these recommendations or the possibilities. Surely many open questions within the framework of our study once the study will be released. But I will ask Liliana just whether there is some other question from the audience. If it's not so, but I will have one more question perhaps to Valentina, but Liliana, please just not to forget about the audience.
Yes, for the moment we don't have new questions, just some positive comments, but no questions. And we remind people, if you still want to make questions, you can use the Q&A or also the chat, and we can make it to the panelists.
Okay, thank you very much.
So go for Valentina.
Thank you. So I will go for Valentina, and we have heard a lot now from the history. What is the terminology? What is the framework of the research? We have not mentioned so much one of the part of the research which is focusing more on, let's say, the political relations, also the political relations within the EU, and what is the peripherality within the EU, or the political manifestation of the peripherality in the EU. And I just wonder, perhaps, although we are now actually writing this part of the study, so it's really work in progress. I just wonder whether Valentina, who is kind of now, in the process of writing, could actually give us a little bit small hint what's to be expected, what are our thoughts on the subject. Valentina?
Yes, thank you for this question. So basically, in this political chapter, we are trying to understand whether those different structural economic conditions and dependencies that we were discussing now lead to overlapping cleavages between the European member states, and whether there is a transnational cleavage between the peripheries within the European Union. And if not, why so? It also tries to understand power and representativeness in the European Union and its institutions. So how much power do those peripheries actually have in the EU? And furthermore, we also analyze and look at the European left parties and their strength in the EU, because we are in the end interested in formulating adequate policy recommendations at the end of our study. And within this research, the European Union's cohesion policy and the European structural and investment funds are very important. Why? Because those instruments were installed in the context of acknowledging the issue of structural imbalances between the northern and southern European states, saying that these structural imbalances needed to be addressed in a more integrated manner. And these reforms were also implemented at the end of the 1980s in view of the completion of the single market in 1992 and the prospects of the introduction of the common currency. And as I already said, and as it was also mentioned by my colleagues, though the industrial production capabilities of the old peripheral EU countries have been severely affected by the opening of their markets. And at the same time, their monetary and exchange policies have had to be adjusted to the convergence criteria. And initially, the policy focus of the European structural and investment funds was on transport and other physical infrastructures. However, the experience of the Euro crisis and the divergent GDP levels between the core and periphery have led to an alternation of the policy focus. So now, recently, they are targeting financial allocations to technological innovations, which we were also discussing previously, briefly, and with the aim that it should upgrade the domestic industries. But this is a very recent change, and we will actually analyze and look whether we see any policy changes that could actually alter those structural imbalances in the peripheral regions in the European Union.
Okay, so we still have 10 minutes to go, and I would like to just make a final question to Veronica, if she can be short in her answer before closing the session, because we are supposed to close at 2:30 my time, 3:30 yours, or 4:30 yours, Veronica. So we have already, have been discussing this issue of peripherality, always in terms, in a time frame that has to do with European Union and the integration of different countries at different time points, of course, in the European Union. My question would be, there was a life and a history before European Union integration. So is this peripherality status, so to speak, or condition, something completely new for these regions?
Thank you. I try to be short as possible, even this is very complex and interesting question. First of all, it's interesting because in a way you can say that neither the South, neither the East was able to break the chains of peripherality in recent 30 years or 40 years. So they actually are, they returned or they are keeping on the position of periphery within the Europe now. We perhaps didn't say totally clearly that we are speaking about peripheries and cores within the core within the European Union. Well, if you would take world economy as such, of course, these countries, all of them are rather semi-peripheral in comparing with other peripheries. But we are saying in the European Union, the peripherality of these regions is not new. It is a long-term diagnosis, I would say, unfortunately. And as I already said before, the Eastern part tried to get out of this position also by means of socialist modernization, by the effort, unsuccessful, to change the structure of economy in a new socialist way and challenge the capitalism. This was not successful, and it is actually symptomatic that the result is that we are back in the peripheral position after this detour, as Ivan Berendt, as I was quoting already, calls it. In the case of Southern Europe, you have diverse situation. I already said that for part of the European project, Italy could be seen as rather a semi-core country, which is peripherized. But historically, Italy was, of course, switching between periphery and core in the European history, or in the history of European capitalism. If you look at the medieval period or early modern period, Italy was definitely the core. It's the place where banks are developed and many modern instruments of the capitalism are invented. The same can be said about Portugal and Spain. These two countries were, for a short part of the history, really core countries of the newly established colonial modern world system, thanks to the expansion to Atlantic. They were for about 100 years really having the path which could end in the core. Unfortunately, now I don't want to go to details why it happened. They were not able to compete with the North Atlantic competitors from France, England, and Netherlands, who took over. And these countries were basically, since the end of 16th century onward, all the time basically peripheralized. So it's not new. That's the interesting thing. And what is interesting thing about the European project, that despite all the promises, despite all the speech about innovativeness, convergence, cohesion, we are back where we have been before, only with changing the roles of core. Core is now mostly Germany and Benelux countries in the European Union, I mean, but we are not in some historically unique situation in this sense. So we have to again return to the basics to be able to, I think, address it. And now we have possibility, I think, first time in history to address it together. Because, by the way, the part of East Europe is, of course, traditional periphery of European and world economy. It's the place also which was always basically peripheral. While the core, the Western Europe was industrializing. This was the basically agricultural production, agricultural capitalism place since also 16th century. So a lot, by the way, a lot happened in the 16th century. This is something which we will also very shortly speak about in the beginning of study, because this is kind of bifurcation which happened in Europe. And one of the important factors in it was if you was or not by the sea, by the Atlantic Sea, necessary to say by the ocean. So it's I think historically it's quite interesting how something what seems to be unique, it's actually not very much unique, and how the capitalist system works according to very same principles all 500 years since it was developed.
Okay. Thank you, Veronica. So I suppose we are heading towards the end of this workshop. We have 4 minutes left. So before we disconnect, I would like, on my behalf and on the behalf of my colleague Dagmar, I want to thank the audience for taking their time in participating in this workshop organized by Transform Europe in the context of the European Forum 2021. I also want to thank our invited speakers and researchers in this study for their enlightening inputs and discussion on this question of Euro peripheries. I further want to thank the interpreters for their invisible but valuable work, and also, of course, Liliana from the European Forum organization for her help throughout the workshop. So, as we told you before, the full study will be published in the first quarter of 2022, and it will be presented publicly at some point. If you are interested in receiving information on this study, please let us know. Within the next days, you will receive an email from us as a follow-up of this workshop. So just answer stating your interest in this study follow-up. Last but not least, just to remind you that European Forum continues online until tomorrow, and that on Friday and Saturday, so the 26th and 27th, it will be taking place physically in Brussels, but it still can be followed online. During the session, Liliana was putting in the chat the information you need to join. So maybe just to give the last word to Dagmar, and I think this is it.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I think that I don't need to add anything. Everything was already said. I would also just to thank everyone, as Tatiana said, and I very much hope that once the study is released, that you will find your time to check it up. Follow, as always, Transform website. You can follow other events of Transform. We have multiple webinars, interesting studies which are released and published on on the site. We have also the Facebook channel, which releases regularly and information which may be interesting for you. So I would just say thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us, and see you on the other occasions. All the best to all of you.